the important key topics of President Putin's annual direct line broadcast. The key questions. Here we see a slide now. Social policy. Look at the margin it leads by. Next are infrastructure, the state and society, housing, and the economy. And somewhere 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, only in sixth place, we have the so-called special military operation. So social policy, why is it in first place? Because, friends, the sanctions are working. And if we compare this particular direct line, the traditional one, which takes place at the beginning or in the middle of December and is held by the president of the Russian Federation, then we can draw some conclusions. A conclusion that it is becoming increasingly difficult to hide problems in the economy and finance. In Russia, it is becoming more and more difficult, even for the organizers of this Kremlin completely propagandistic, phantasmagorical event like Putin's communication with his people. By the way, this communication didn't really go well today. There were a lot of moments that really stood out. For example, the questions that were shown on the big screen. Well, we understand that in principle, this is a pretty well-prepared event. And if something does accidentally make it into the frame or onto the big screen, those are isolated incidents. This time, these are not isolated incidents. The entire internet is exploding right now because of the kind of questions that were thrown at Putin. Well, for example, here's one. Hello, who will be the next president of Russia? I'd like to take a closer look. A question that's hard to even imagine. Well, who will be the next president? Well, of course, it will be Vladimir Putin. But how did this question even get in there? And it spread across all the Telegram channels. Here's another example, just as interesting. Why are there no free elections in the country, for governors in this case, for mayors, and so on? Who is afraid of this? Well, I'll tell you who is afraid of this, and Putin knows it too. It's us who are afraid of this. Sergei Kiriyenko, a friend of Alla Pugacheva, the person who, in Putin's presidential administration, is currently responsible for this very track, local governments, local elites, and local governors. Right now, the relationship between the elites, regional, and the Kremlin in the Russian Federation is quite complicated. Why is that? Well, because all the resources are being drained. In fact, the resources for contributions to the national budget are being exhausted due to the continued existence of this so-called special military operation. The sign-on bonuses that have to be paid to these mobilized soldiers, the amount of money that has to be allocated and promised to servicemen and their families, is not an endless well, so to speak. And today, there is already significant open protest from at least 7 distinct federal subjects. For example, the Amur region is one such area. In my opinion, this is the leader who is rallying everyone around this movement because, well, that's it. The budget is absolutely running out. By the way, there were a lot of questions. I was following this live broadcast. A lot of questions were about issues like, when will someone be recognized as a combat veteran and get a white Lada? And why are the payments still not coming? Where is my housing? Because we were heroes there. We liberated something somewhere in Donbass. Here's the story. Friends, there's just not enough money. That's why when Putin, for example, shows off these pieces of paper and says, look, everything is fine with our economy, it's all about these very pieces of paper. So I specifically went online and looked it up. There's already a zoomed in image showing exactly what Putin is displaying. He's showing a chart with the latest data on the Russian economy, the one that was prepared for him. There are a few points on it. GDP growth in the Russian Federation, 1%. Friends, let me tell you this. According to economic theory, 1% is not just stagnation. Stagnation is considered to be around 3.5% or 4%. This is not economic growth. Even plus 3% is not economic growth. 1% is basically nothing at all. And let's imagine that this is a country that has been living for the 4th year under absolute just, a military industrial complex. In such a resource-based paradigm, its economy should be growing, but it isn't. Why? Sanctions are working. Sanctions are working. And if Putin gets scared there, the shadow fleet, those questions were also raised to him today. A tanker was hit today, as you know, in neutral waters in the Mediterranean Sea. And it's obvious that this was an operation, also by the security service of Ukraine. We need to wait for more detailed information. He has already commented on this, said there will be some responses, but globally, it only affects the cost of credit insurance for these boats and these cargoes. This is absolutely untrue. Yes, just 1%, and this is an inflated figure for the industry, a 1% increase. 103 million square meters of housing were built. The growth rate of real wages is 4.5%. But considering the bonuses that Putin's soldiers receive, thank you. Yes, for the mobilized, on average, such wage growth can happen. That I can believe, yes. So the growth of the working population, production is up by 1.1%. Putin said he's dissatisfied and that the unemployment rate needs to be changed. The historic low of 2.2%. Well, of course, if they took everyone and found them all jobs in the armed forces of the Russian Federation, the budget deficit of the Russian Federation is no more than 1.5%. That's a questionable claim as well. And the central bank's reserves are $741 billion. Basically, Putin is saying that he can calmly continue the war for another 2 years. The war in Ukraine is costing the Russian Federation $350 billion. But do these reserves actually take into account the assets scattered around the world from Japan to the European Union? That's not specified here. Next, something else interesting. Yes, we've talked about the governors, and here's another interesting slide that concerns you have a lot of, and don't the advisors and assistants feel that maybe they're hoping for the wrong things or being misunderstood if the people are dissatisfied? Here's another story, please. And why don't the deputies in our country live by the laws they themselves pass? Well, and this is already a hint that Putin, you're not in control of the situation. Vladimir Vladimirovich, it's already Friday, time to have a beer. Well, that's clear, I think. This is something planned to relax the population of the Russian Federation, which lives in a paradigm of peace. In reality, yes, the special military operation is somewhere far away, but here, well, we have a beer on Fridays. Why do ordinary people live worse than Papuans? But this is just great, right? SMS message. In general, gratitude probably needs to be some kind of express it to this editor who was sitting on these SMS messages because, well, the person is clearly dissatisfied. Here are a few more excerpts. Let's take a look at them.
So in the hall, they accept that war is a heavy burden on the economy. Yes, and the European clowns, as you called them the other day, continue to do everything to, as they say, destroy the Russian economy.
Well, and this is Zarubin, friends. This is a person you can't call a journalist or a host. He is an absolute propagandist from start to finish. He's Putin's tail, following him around the world, running his own Telegram channel, and on it, well, he calls it super exclusive. He's literally right at the leader of the nation's elbow. Even he, as you can see, drew attention to the fact and said that war is a burden on the economy. I truly do not know, but perhaps this could very well be Zarubin's absolute last working day, especially since he allowed himself to openly use such incredibly strong and rather inappropriate wording. And in fact, he made mistakes in his wording more than once today. There was another episode. Putin made a remark to him after he phrased a question about the likelihood of a reparations loan from the frozen assets of the Russian Federation. Zarubin used a word that Putin didn't like, and Putin, he made a jab at Zarubin. Well, at the very least, this guy should be deprived of his bonus. One more clip to wrap up. Let's go. Prices for groceries and buns in the cafeteria are going up, but my parents don't have any salaries. Well, that's kind of a child's question. Somewhere, as I understand, from the Russian hinterland to Putin, who declared that he has 750 billion for the war. Well, because war, imperial ambitions, and playing at being a power that supposedly decides something, these are absolutely more important to Putin than children going hungry. In the Russian Federation, this whole story is really about social issues. Let me show you this slide again. It's quite telling, and it seems to me that it's getting harder and harder for Putin now to explain things to his population of the Russian Federation. Why is it that this so-called special military operation, where, as he noted, there are currently 700,000 military personnel? By the way, that number is accurate, confirmed by our general staff, 700,000. It's actually true, he didn't lie today, but he's proud that there are 700,000 soldiers there. So explaining and clarifying why these 700,000 Russians are now in the so-called special military operation zone, in this so-called zone, is becoming more and more difficult. And that's truly good news, my friends. The more difficult and challenging it gets, the sooner we will see the end of this this fabricated reality, this illusion invented by Putin, in which the Russian Federation now unfortunately lives.